My name is Vorath Sen. I am a senior diplomatic observer for the K'Lun Collective. I have attended 42 first contact ceremonies, 3 intergalactic treaty signings, and 1 very embarrassing miscommunication involving a Turvani elder and a bowl of what we thought was decorative fruit. I am not easily surprised. I was surprised that day. Let me tell you exactly how it happened. The K'Lun Collective had been watching the human species for approximately 11 of their years before making official contact. 11 years. That is a long time to watch something before saying hello. But the collective does not rush. The collective observes. The collective prepares reports. The collective holds meetings about the reports. Then the collective holds more meetings about whether the first meetings reached the correct conclusions. By the time we finally sent our first diplomatic vessel to the human homeworld, we had 642 separate intelligence files on human civilization. We had cataloged their languages, their governments, their entertainment habits, and their alarming tendency to voluntarily eat things that their own biology flagged as dangerous. 642 files. None of them had prepared us for Commander Rhea Malone. The meeting was held on a neutral station, Kestrel 6, a mid-range diplomatic hub orbiting a quiet gas giant, chosen specifically because it was, in the words of our protocol chief, boring enough that nobody would feel threatened. The K'Lun delegation was 12 strong. We wore our formal ash-gray diplomat coats with the silver collar lights that indicate rank. Our delegation leader, Ambassador Tuvek Oran, stood at the front. Ambassador Oran had bronze-toned skin, the subtle cheek ridges of old K'Lun nobility, and the kind of expression that had made 7 alien species sign treaties they later regretted. He was, by any reasonable measure, an intimidating individual. He had brought his personal security chief, Commander Dras Vael, along for additional visual impact. Commander Vael was tall, built like a load-bearing wall, with deep violet skin and a smooth, earless head that he kept perfectly polished. Dras Vael did not need to speak to make his point. His point was already clear. His point was that he could end you, and he had already eaten breakfast, so he was not even hungry. We had also brought sub-diplomat Aaron Tail, who was young, nervous, and had spent the entire transit rereading the human files on his datapad. Aaron kept whispering statistics to himself quietly. Things like humans survive ambient temperatures that would hospitalize a Vothran, and recorded cases of humans wrestling large predators for sport. He had not slept well. Neither had I, honestly. The human delegation arrived 7 minutes early. That was the first sign. In galactic diplomacy, arriving early is considered mildly aggressive. It signals confidence. It says, "We were ready before you expected," and that was intentional. Most new species either arrive exactly on time, nervously precise, or slightly late, trying to look relaxed. Arriving early is something experienced players do. The humans arrived 7 minutes early, and they walked like they owned the corridor. There were 4 of them. The lead negotiator was a human male. His name was Director Bram Cho. He was lean, well-dressed in a dark uniform with clean lines, and had sharp eyes behind a calm face. Beside him was a human woman with warm bronze-brown skin, dark hair pulled into a precise knot, and a data tablet tucked under her arm. She was introduced as Dr. Lena Osi, Senior Scientific Liaison. She had the quiet, organized energy of someone who had already calculated 17 possible outcomes for this meeting and ranked them by probability. The third human was a tall, broad-shouldered man named Lieutenant Vasile Dorin, dark-eyed and square-jawed, with that particular stillness that security-trained beings always carry. He stood slightly behind and to the right of Director Cho. His hands were clasped behind his back. He watched Dras Vael without blinking. Dras Vael noticed, and then there was the fourth one. Commander Rhea Malone. I want to be precise about this, because I have heard other members of our delegation describe her in ways that I think miss the actual point. Aaron Tail later said she looked unnervingly calm. Ambassador Oran wrote in his official report that she displayed atypical behavioral indicators for a first-contact environment. Dras Vael said nothing about her in any official capacity, which, from Dras Vael, was actually its own kind of statement. Here is what I observed directly. Rhea Malone was not the tallest human in the room. She was not the largest. She had mid-length dark auburn hair, light olive skin, and pale gray eyes that caught the station lighting and held it. She wore a commander's uniform in deep navy, with no decorative rank symbols beyond a single small pin on her collar. She carried no visible equipment. She carried no datapad. She carried no weapon. She walked into that diplomatic chamber like she had already been there 100 times, found her assigned seat without looking at the seating chart, sat down, and smiled. That smile. I need to talk about that smile. It was not a nervous smile. It was not a diplomatic smile, the kind that says, I am happy to be here, and I hope we can work together. It was not even a confident smile. Not exactly. It was the smile of someone who finds the entire situation quietly amusing, and who is too polite to say why. Ambassador Oran noticed it immediately. I know because his cheek ridges shifted, which is what they do when something has caught his attention that he has not yet categorized. He introduced himself with full title and lineage, as is proper Kalen custom. Director Cho responded in kind, smooth, and professional. The opening formalities proceeded correctly. Then, Ambassador Oran did something I had seen him do 42 times before. He made the gesture. The Kalen formal display of authority is called the Vreth gesture. It involves standing, extending both arms slightly outward with palms down, and allowing your collar lights to pulse at full brightness. It communicates in a single visual signal, I represent a power that extends far beyond this room. It is specifically designed for first contact meetings with civilizations that have not yet been formally evaluated for status. It is, bluntly, a dominance display, a polished, legally acceptable, beautifully diplomatic dominance display, but a dominance display nonetheless. 42 species had responded to the Vreth gesture the same way. Some froze. Some leaned back. Some immediately began talking faster, trying to fill the silence with reassurances. One species, the Briveth, had actually started applauding, which had been awkward for everyone. Every single species had reacted. Rhea Malone tilted her, head approximately 6 degrees to the left. She looked at the collar lights. She looked at Ambassador Oran's face, and she smiled wider. Not a mocking smile, not a challenging smile. That is the part that got under everyone's skin, I think, including mine. It was an interested smile, like she had just seen something she recognized, like she had just watched someone do a card trick she already knew, and she was deciding whether to say so. Sub-diplomat Aaron Tail made a small sound beside me. I believe it was involuntary. Director Cho continued talking as if nothing had happened, because Director Cho was a professional. Dr. Lena Osi was writing something on her tablet, small and quick. Lieutenant Doran had not moved at all. Ambassador Oran lowered his arms slowly. His collar lights dimmed back to baseline. He sat down. He continued the meeting with precisely the same composure he always maintained. But I had been working with Ambassador Oran for 9 years. His jaw was tight. The first hour of the meeting was standard. trade access discussions, territorial boundary acknowledgement, communication protocol agreements. Director Cho was precise and knowledgeable. Dr. Osi interjected twice with data that was, I will admit, impressively well organized. The humans had clearly prepared. Commander Malone said almost nothing during the first hour. She sat at the far end of the human side of the table, slightly relaxed, one arm resting on the table surface. She listened, she watched. Occasionally, she wrote something short on a small physical notepad, which none of us had expected because we had assumed all humans used digital equipment exclusively. At one point, Dras Vael shifted position deliberately. He moved from standing against the wall to standing directly visible in Malone's line of sight. It was a subtle shift. It was the kind of thing that, if you pointed it out, Dras Vael could reasonably call coincidence. It was not coincidence. Dras Vael had done this exact thing to 3 alien security officers at previous meetings. The first 2 had immediately repositioned themselves, moving away or re-angling their bodies. The third had straightened up and started monitoring their breathing more carefully. Malone looked at him. She nodded once, with the small, polite nod of someone acknowledging a colleague across a crowded room. Then she looked back at her notepad and continued writing. Dras Vael stood very still. I watched his jaw do the same thing Ambassador Oran's had done. The second hour was when things became genuinely interesting. Ambassador Oran brought up the question of human military capacity. This is standard in these discussions. It is framed diplomatically, of course. The official language is mutual security assessment and comparative defense capability review. What it actually means is, we need to understand how dangerous you are so we can decide how carefully to speak to you. Director Cho began answering. He was precise, measured, and revealed exactly the right amount of information. He had clearly done this before. Then Ambassador Orion asked the question he always asks in these situations. He leaned forward slightly, collar lights at a low, steady pulse, and said, "And what is the psychological profile of your frontline personnel, specifically regarding high-risk environments?" It sounds like an administrative question. It is not. What it means is, do your soldiers break? Do they hesitate? Do they panic? Because ours do not. Director Cho paused. He glanced sideways briefly toward Rhea Malone. Malone set down her pen. For the first time in 2 hours, she spoke. Her voice was even. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear and unhurried, the way someone speaks when they are accustomed to being heard in noisy places. She said, "Ambassador Oran, do you know what a Deathworld is?" The room went quiet. Ambassador Oran said carefully, "I am familiar with the classification." Malone nodded. "Then, you know what it means that we evolved there. Not visited, not survived temporarily. Evolved. Over millions of years. Every generation, the ones who panicked died. The ones who hesitated died. The ones who could not adapt died." She paused. "What was selected for," she said, "was us." She picked up her pen. She smiled again. That same smile. Nobody spoke for approximately 4 seconds, which, in a diplomatic chamber, is a very long time. Then Dr. Osi quietly turned a page on her tablet. Director Cho folded his hands on the table. Lieutenant Doran continued not blinking. Ambassador Oran looked at Rhea Malone for a long moment. His collar lights pulsed once. She did not react. He looked away first. I wrote in my observation log, in the smallest handwriting I could manage, 3 words. "This is different." The meeting resumed after a short recess. Ambassador Oran had called the recess himself, which was unusual. In 9 years, I had never seen him call a recess during an opening session. Recesses were for situations where calculations had shifted, where new information required internal discussion, where something had gone differently than planned. Something had gone differently than planned. In the small side room reserved for our delegation, Oran stood by the narrow viewport and looked at the gas giant below. Aaron Tail stood near the door, still holding his data pad, which he had stopped reading because no file on it was currently useful to him. Drasvael leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and said nothing. I said, "She was not threatening us." Oran said, "I know." I said, "That is what made it effective." He turned from the viewport. His cheek ridges were settled, composed, the expression he wore when he had finished processing something, and moved on to practical considerations. She answered a question I did not ask her directly. She answered the real question, the one underneath the formal language. "Yes," I said, and she did it without aggression, without posturing, without any of the signals that would have allowed us to categorize it as a territorial response. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "What category does that fall into, Vorath?" I thought about it, honestly. "Confidence," I said. "The kind that does not need an audience." Oran looked at me steadily. Then he said, "Adjust my approach for the second session. We treat this delegation as full peers." Aaron made a small sound again. I think it was relief. When we returned to the table, the atmosphere had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that would appear in the official recording, but in the small physical language of the room, things were different. Oran sat more squarely. His collar lights stayed at a neutral, conversational pulse. He did not perform any further gestures. Director Cho noticed. He gave a small nod that meant nothing officially and everything practically. The second session moved faster. The territorial acknowledgement language was settled within 20 minutes, which typically takes most of a day. Dr. Osi and our senior scientist, researcher Fen Arilo, began a sidebar conversation about atmospheric data exchange that quickly turned into something resembling genuine enthusiasm on both sides. Fen had the wide-eyed look of someone who had just been handed a gift they did not expect. Lieutenant Doran and Drasvael remained at their respective positions on opposite sides of the room. At some point during the resource mapping discussion, I noticed that their postures had matched. Both standing, both arms behind the back, both watching the room with the same patient, professional attention. Neither of them appeared to have coordinated this. Neither of them appeared to find it strange. Commander Malone spoke 4 more times during the second session. The first time was to correct a translation error in the boundary documentation that our own linguistic team had missed. She did it quietly, directing the comment to the table in general rather than pointing at anyone specifically. The correction was right. Our translator, a careful and experienced professional named Sev Oriath, checked the source document and confirmed it without speaking, then updated the text. Sev looked slightly pained. Malone did not notice, or chose not to. The second time was when the discussion turned to joint patrol protocols along the proposed shared transit corridor. This is always a tense section of any agreement. It involves questions of authority, escalation response, and what happens when 2 species with different reflexes and different threat assessments occupy the same space under pressure. Director Cho was explaining the human escalation ladder, the formal sequence of responses that human officers follow when a situation develops. It was clear, well-structured, and covered most scenarios. Ambassador Orayan asked about exceptions. Malone said, "The ladder is a guideline. The officer on the ground is the final authority." Oran looked at her carefully. "That introduces significant variability." "Yes," she said. "It also means the person with the most information makes the call, not someone 3 communication relays away." Fen Aralo looked up from his sidebar conversation with Dr. Osi. Orion said, and you trust your officers to make those calls correctly." Malone looked at him with those pale gray eyes, steady and unblinking. "We trained them. If we do not trust them, that is a training failure, not a protocol failure." Orion was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a reasonable position." Coming from Orion, that was approximately equivalent to applause. The third time Malone spoke was shorter. One of our junior diplomatic aides, a young Kaelin named Prestilve, who had never attended a first contact session before and was visibly nervous about it, knocked over his water vessel during a pause in discussion. It made a sharp sound. Cold liquid spread across the table. Prestile went AE, shade of bronze that meant extreme embarrassment in Kaelin physiological terms. Before anyone else could react, Malone had already pulled an absorbent cloth from somewhere, leaned forward, and placed it over the spill in a single, easy motion. She said to Prestile, without any particular weight to it, "First big meeting?" Prestile said, barely audibly, "Yes, Commander." She said, "You are doing fine," handed him a clean cloth for his hands, and looked back at the table as if nothing had happened. Prestile spent the rest of the meeting sitting approximately 3 centimeters straighter. The fourth time was the one I wrote 3 full pages about in my observer's log. We had reached the final section: security cooperation. Specifically, the question of what happens if either species encounters a threat that exceeds the capacity of one party to address alone. This is, diplomatically, a very delicate section. It requires admitting the possibility of vulnerability, which no species enjoys, doing at a first meeting. Ambassador Oran presented our position formally. The Kaelin Collective was willing to share threat intelligence on a provisional basis, pending full treaty ratification. Director Cho responded that the human administration was willing to consider a mutual response framework. Details to be negotiated in subsequent sessions. Standard. Safe. The kind of language that means yes without saying yes. Then Orion looked at Malone directly. He had not done that before. Not as an intentional directing of a question. He had simply looked at whoever was speaking. This was different. He said, "Commander Malone, in your professional assessment, if a threat emerged in the transit corridor before full treaty ratification, before formal protocols were in place, what would your response be?" The room was quiet. It was, in every technical sense, an inappropriate question for this stage of negotiation. It was asking for a personal military commitment that no individual officer could officially give. Everyone at the table knew that. Director Cho drew a breath, preparing to redirect. Malone raised one hand slightly. Just a small movement. Cho stopped. She looked at Oran. She said, "Ambassador, if something was threatening my corridor, and I had the capacity to stop it, I would stop it. The paperwork would catch up." She paused. "That is not a treaty position," she said. "That is just the answer to your question." Arantel made his small sound for the third time. Drasvael, against the wall, looked at the ceiling briefly. His expression was not readable to most species. I had worked with him long enough to recognize it. He was amused. The session closed 2 hours later. Agreements initialed, schedules set for subsequent negotiation rounds, communication keys exchanged. The formal end-of-session handshake protocol was completed, which among Kaelin involves a brief press of right palms, a gesture that carries a meaning approximately equivalent to, "I acknowledge you as a being worth returning to." Ambassador Orion shook Director Cho's hand. Then Dr. Osi's. Then Lieutenant Doran's, which required a very slight upward adjustment of Orion's arm because Doran was taller than expected. Then Orion stood in front of Rhea Malone. He extended his hand. She took it. They held the grip for 1 second, 2, 3, slightly longer than the others, not dramatically, just noticeably. Oran said quietly, in a register I had to lean slightly to hear, "Your civilization is going to be very difficult to manage diplomatically." Malone looked at him with that expression, the one that was not quite a smile yet, hovering just before it, and said, "Ambassador, we have been managing ourselves for 100,000 years. You will be fine." Then the smile arrived. Orion let go of her hand. He actually laughed. A short sound, surprised, out of him. I had heard Orion laugh approximately 4 times in 9 years. This was the 5th. On the transport back, Aaron Tell finally put his datapad away. He sat looking at the viewport for a long time. Then he said, 642 files. I said, yes. He said, we should probably add more. I said, several more. He was quiet again. Then, Vorath. The files mention that humans have a saying. Something about the danger being underestimated. Not the one who shouts. The quiet one. I thought about pale gray eyes. About a smile that arrived without announcement. About the fact that the most secure individual in that room had carried no visible weapon, worn no rank symbols worth counting, and had introduced herself to a junior aide's embarrassment with more grace than most senior diplomats manage in a full career. Yes, I said. I believe I understand that saying now. Aaron nodded slowly. He looked back at the viewport. After a long moment, he said, "Do you think she knew? From the start? That the ambassador would look away first?" I considered the question properly. I thought about the smile she had worn when she walked in, before any dominance display, before any test, before any question had been asked. The smile that was already there, already settled, already completely at home in a room full of species she had never met. Yes, I said. I think she walked in already knowing. Aaron absorbed that. That is either very reassuring, he said carefully, or very alarming. I looked out at the stars and thought about Deathworlds, about millions of years of the unprepared disappearing quietly from history, about what remains when only the prepared survive. Generation after generation after generation. Both, I said. I think it is both. My official report to the Kalen Collective was 47 pages long. The last line read, "Recommend immediate elevation of human civilization to full peer diplomatic status. Recommend immediate review of all existing behavioral models. Recommend that any collective diplomat assigned to future human negotiations be specifically briefed on the difference between a species that is calm because nothing threatens it, and a species that is calm because it has already decided what it will do if something does." Ambassador Oran reviewed